Good evening, and welcome to the Archives of the Unseen, the place where we unearth the stories that lie buried beneath the floorboards of history. We are drawn to the cases that defy simple explanation, the discoveries that leave even the most hardened investigators sleepless, questioning the very nature of the darkness that can reside in the human heart. Tonight's story is one such case. It begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, unsettling discovery in the cool, dark earth of a forgotten wine cellar. It is a tale of a shocking atrocity, a secret so macabre, so meticulously cruel, that the object containing it, an ornate, unassuming wine jar, became a vessel for a horror that would echo for decades. This is a journey into the heart of a calculated evil, a look at a discovery so dark it sent chills through the very soul of the police force that uncovered it. Before we descend into the cellar's shadows, if you are a seeker of the stories that linger in the dark, the mysteries that challenge our understanding of the world, then please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. You will not want to miss the unsettling truths we bring to light. Now, let the dust settle, let the silence deepen, and let us tell you the story of the Serafina Valley atrocity, the letter that changed Leo's life, and in doing so, unearthed a horror that had lain dormant for half a century. Arrived on a Tuesday. It was an anomaly in his mailbox, a thick, cream-colored envelope amidst the usual deluge of junk mail and soulless, windowed bills. The paper felt ancient, textured like old money, and the address was written in an elegant, spidery cursive that belonged to a bygone era. It was from a law firm in a town he'd never heard of, Oak Haven, nestled somewhere in the heart of the Serafina Valley wine country. Leo was a creature of the city, his world defined by the predictable grid of streets, the perpetual hum of traffic, and the comforting anonymity of a million other lives pressing in around him. He was a graphic designer, his days spent manipulating pixels on a screen, creating clean, sterile beauty for corporate clients who paid well for his distinct lack of sentimentality. His connection to his family was tenuous at best, a series of frayed threads leading back to a past he had consciously and successfully walled off. So, the name on the letter's return address, the estate of Silas Croft, stirred something deep and dusty within him, a memory of a name whispered with a mixture of awe and unease by his grandmother when he was a child. Great Uncle Silas, the recluse, the genius, the man who had, for reasons never fully explained, completely severed himself from the family tree decades ago. The letter was formal, its language cold and precise. Silas Croft had passed away at the age of 94. As his last living relative, albeit a distant one, Leo was the sole heir to his entire estate. The estate, the letter detailed, consisted primarily of the Villa Serafina and its accompanying 20 acres of vineyards, currently in a state of considerable neglect. Leo's first instinct was to laugh. A vineyard? Him. A man whose knowledge of wine was limited to the color and the price point, who considered a potted succulent on his windowsill a monumental commitment to the natural world. His second instinct was a familiar, cynical calculation. A dilapidated property in wine country, even a neglected one, had to be worth something. He could liquidate it, take the money, and bolster the sterile, uncomplicated life he had so carefully constructed for himself. It was a problem, but a potentially profitable one. 2 weeks later, after a long, winding drive that took him from the concrete canyons of the metropolis to the rolling, sun-drenched hills of the Serafina Valley, Leo stood before the Villa Serafina. The lawyer's description of neglect had been a profound and generous understatement. It was a place being actively reclaimed by nature. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the faded ochre stucco, its tendrils prying into the cracks and crevices of the architecture. The once manicured gardens were a riotous, overgrown jungle of weeds and defiant, blooming roses. The villa itself, a sprawling two-story structure of Mediterranean influence, seemed to sigh under the weight of its own loneliness. It was beautiful, but it was the tragic, haunting beauty of decay. The lawyer, a small, bird-like man named Mr. Abernathy, who seemed to be perpetually sweating despite the cool valley breeze, handed him a comically large, ornate iron key. He was a very private man, Mr. Croft, Abernathy said, his voice a dry rustle of old paper. He hadn't had a visitor in, I'd say the better part of 30 years. Lived a life of routine. The grocer would leave his supplies on the porch. The Vintners Guild would send a man to collect his yearly samples. But no one ever went inside. Not until the end. The inside of the villa was a time capsule. A thick layer of dust covered everything. A fine gray powder that muted all color and softened every edge. It was as if time had stopped the moment Silas Croft had locked the door on the outside world. The furniture was heavy and dark. Intricately carved pieces that spoke of a forgotten craftsmanship. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes on oenology, chemistry, botany, and classical poetry. It was the home of a scholar, a man of profound and varied interests, but there was an unnerving, almost suffocating sense of order to it all. Every book was perfectly aligned, every object placed with a meticulous, almost obsessive precision. It was not the comfortable clutter of a life lived, but the sterile, curated neatness of a museum exhibit. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, nothing to suggest that Silas Croft had ever loved or been loved by another human being. Leo spent the first few days in a state of overwhelmed detachment, creating a mental inventory of the assets, the liabilities, the sheer, daunting scale of the task ahead of him. He planned to hire a professional cleaning service, an estate appraiser, and a real estate agent. He would strip the place of its value and be back in his clean, predictable city life within a month. It was on the fourth day that he decided to tackle the wine cellar. According to Mr. Abernathy, the cellar was the heart of the Villa Serafina, the place where Silas had practiced his legendary, if reclusive, craft. It was accessed through a heavy, oak door at the back of the kitchen, a door that groaned in protest as Leo turned the ancient, rusted lock. A wave of cool, musty air, thick with the scent of damp earth, rich soil, and the ghost of fermented grapes, washed over him as he descended the steep stone steps. The cellar was vast, far larger than he had anticipated, a labyrinth of stone archways and dark, receding corridors. Racks of wine bottles, their labels faded and illegible, lined the walls, their contents a mystery of years past. It was a vintner's paradise, a treasure trove of sleeping history. He spent the morning exploring, a flashlight cutting a lonely beam through the oppressive darkness. Most of the cellar was a chaotic jumble of discarded equipment, rotting barrels, and empty bottles. It seemed that this was the one area of the villa that had escaped Silas's obsessive, meticulous order. But as he ventured deeper, into the oldest section of the cellar, he noticed something odd. One of the stone walls at the very back of the furthest chamber looked different. The mortar between the stones was newer, a lighter shade of gray than the crumbling, ancient mortar of the surrounding walls. It was a patch, a seal. Curiosity, an emotion he rarely indulged, got the better of him. He found a rusty crowbar amongst the debris and began to work at the edges of the newer stones. It was slow, arduous work, his city-soft hands quickly blistering. But with a final grunt of effort, the first stone came loose, clattering to the floor with a sound that was unnervingly loud in the profound silence. Behind it was not earth, but darkness. An empty space. He had found a hidden room, a secret chamber within the cellar. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and a strange, primal trepidation. With renewed vigor, he pulled away the rest of the stones, revealing a small, dark opening just large enough to squeeze through. The air that seeped from the hidden chamber was different. It was still cool and damp, but it was laced with a strange, cloying, and faintly sweet smell that he couldn't quite identify. It was a smell that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He squeezed through the opening, his flashlight beam dancing nervously across the interior of the secret room. It was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet, its stone walls bare and featureless. But it was not empty. In the center of the room, standing alone with an almost ceremonial reverence, was a single, enormous terracotta wine jar. It was a dolium, an ancient Roman-style fermentation vessel, a work of art in itself. It stood nearly 5 feet tall, its belly wide and round, its surface adorned with an intricate, faded bas-relief of dancing maenads and grapevines. It was, without a doubt, the most valuable and beautiful object he had found in the entire villa. But there was something wrong with it. The lid, a heavy, flat disc of terracotta, was sealed shut with a thick, dark, almost black, wax. And it was from this jar that the strange, sweet, and deeply unsettling smell was emanating. Leo was a pragmatist, a man of logic and reason. But in that cold, dark, silent room, standing before that ancient, sealed vessel, he felt a profound and irrational sense of dread. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to seal the room back up, to walk away and never look back. But the pragmatist in him, the part of him that was already calculating the jar's potential auction price, won out. He had to know what was inside. Was it a legendary, priceless vintage? A lost recipe of his great-uncle's? He returned to the main cellar and found a heavy mallet. Back in the hidden chamber, he took a deep breath, the sweet, cloying air filling his lungs, and began to tap at the wax seal. It was thick and brittle, and it began to crack and splinter under the force of his blows. With each crack, the smell grew stronger, more potent, and he began to feel a wave of dizziness, of nausea. Finally, with a sharp, cracking sound, the seal broke. Using the crowbar, he pried the heavy lid up and slid it to the side. The smell that billowed out was overwhelming, a putrid, sickeningly sweet perfume that made him gag and stumble backward. It was the smell of old wine, yes, but it was mingled with something else, something metallic and organic. Something rotten. He held his breath, his curiosity now warring with a growing, sickening horror. He shone his flashlight into the jar's dark, gaping mouth. The contents were a dark, almost black, liquid, thick and opaque like molasses. And floating just below the surface was something pale, something white. He reached in, his hand trembling, and his fingers brushed against something that was both firm and yielding, with a texture that was horrifyingly, sickeningly familiar. Felt like skin. Cold, rubbery, and terribly, undeniably human. He snatched his hand back with a choked cry of revulsion, a string of the viscous, dark liquid clinging to his fingers. He retched, stumbling out of the hidden room, the contents of his stomach emptying onto the dusty cellar floor. His mind was a screaming, chaotic void, unable to process what his senses had just told him. After a few minutes, his body still trembling violently, he forced himself to go back. He had to be sure. He had to be wrong. He stood at the entrance of the chamber, not daring to go back inside, and angled his flashlight beam into the jar's dark interior. This time he saw it clearly. The pale, white object shifted in the dark liquid, turning slowly, languidly. It was a hand, a perfectly preserved human hand, its fingers slightly curled, its skin pruned and bleached to a ghostly, horrifying white. As he watched, frozen in a state of pure, unadulterated terror, the liquid swirled again, and a face drifted up from the depths. The face of a woman, her eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep, her features eerily, miraculously intact, her long, dark hair fanning out around her like a macabre halo in the dark, viscous fluid. She was a grotesque, perfectly preserved specimen in a jar. A shocking atrocity, suspended in time, hidden in the dark, silent earth beneath the Villa Serafina. Leo didn't even remember scrambling up the cellar steps, his breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. He burst out into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the valley, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. He dialed 911, his voice a choked, hysterical whisper, the words tumbling out of him, nonsensical and disjointed. But the operator understood enough. A body, a wine jar, the Villa Serafina. Help was on the way. But Leo knew with a chilling, soul-deep certainty that for the woman in the jar, and now for him, help had come far, far too late. Detective Miles Corbin had been a cop for 27 years, the last 15 as a homicide detective in the quiet, sun-drenched Serafina Valley. He was a man who had made his peace with the darkness that lurked just beneath the idyllic, postcard-perfect surface of his jurisdiction. He had seen the ugly, brutal aftermath of domestic disputes fueled by cheap wine and simmering resentments. He had investigated suicides in lonely farmhouses and tragic, senseless accidents on winding country roads. He thought, seen it all. He was a man who prided himself on his professional detachment, his ability to compartmentalize the horror, to treat a body not as a person, but as a puzzle, a collection of evidence to be catalogued and analyzed. But what he saw in the cold, damp, hidden chamber beneath the Villa Serafina that afternoon shattered that carefully constructed detachment. It didn't just chill him to the bone. It felt like it had injected ice into the very marrow of his soul. The initial call had come in as a possible DOA, a standard, almost routine dispatch. But the dispatcher's voice had been tight with a confusion that hinted at something more. The caller was hysterical, rambling about a body inside a wine jar. Corbin had rolled his eyes, anticipating a prank, or perhaps a drunk who had mistaken a fermentation experiment for a corpse. But when he and his younger, far more eager partner, Detective Isabella Rossi, arrived at the Villa Serafina, the sight of Leo Croft dispelled any notion of a hoax. Leo was sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, his face the color of chalk, his eyes wide with a vacant, thousand-yard stare. He was a man who had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had stared right back. Leo led them, his steps unsteady, down into the cellar. The air was thick with the cloying, putrid smell that now, with the knowledge of its source, was unmistakably the scent of chemical preservation and slow, anaerobic decay. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat, a sweet, nauseating perfume of death. When Corbin squeezed through the narrow opening and laid his eyes on the dolium, standing in the center of the small, tomb-like room, a profound sense of unease washed over him. This was not a crime scene as he knew it. This was something else. It was a shrine, a monument to a dark and terrible secret. The county coroner, a man as jaded and world-weary as Corbin himself, was already there, his face a grim, pale mask in the beam of his flashlight. "Miles," he said, his voice a low, strained whisper. "You're not going to believe this." Corbin shone his own heavy-duty flashlight into the jar. He had steeled himself for the grotesque, but the reality was far worse, far more chilling, than anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just a body. It was a composition, a perfectly, almost lovingly preserved specimen. The woman, suspended in the dark, viscous fluid, was eerily, unnaturally intact. Her skin, though bleached to a ghostly, alabaster white, was unblemished. Her features were serene, her long dark hair floating around her head like a gorgon's crown. The liquid, which the forensic team would later identify as a complex, wine-based chemical cocktail containing formaldehyde and other powerful preservatives, had done its work with a horrifying, miraculous efficacy. It had arrested time, cheated decay, and in doing so, had created a spectacle of profound and stomach-churning horror. "It's a work of art," Rossi whispered from behind him, her voice trembling with a mixture of revulsion and awe. A sick, twisted, horrifying work of art. And that was the word that stuck in Corbin's mind. Art. This was not the result of a panicked, passion-fueled act of violence. This was the work of a meticulous, patient, and deeply, profoundly disturbed individual. This was a premeditated masterpiece of macabre preservation. The killer hadn't just wanted to hide a body. He had wanted to keep it, to preserve it, to possess it, forever. The process of removing the body from the jar was a logistical and emotional nightmare. The forensic team had to carefully drain the viscous, foul-smelling liquid, bucket by agonizing bucket, before they could even attempt to lift the woman's fragile, preserved form from her terracotta tomb. It was a slow, delicate, and deeply unsettling process, performed in a hushed, reverent silence, as if they were archaeologists excavating the remains of a long-lost queen. As the investigation began in earnest, the focus naturally fell on the only known inhabitant of the Villa Serafina, the deceased Silas Croft. The picture that emerged from the few who knew him, and from the state of the villa itself, was that of a brilliant but profoundly antisocial man. He was a gifted enologist and a self-taught chemist, a man who had, in his youth, been considered a visionary in the field of viticulture. But something had happened. Decades ago, he had simply withdrawn from the world, becoming a hermit, a local legend, a boogeyman to frighten the valley's children. The villa was a treasure trove of evidence, a perfectly preserved snapshot of a disturbed and obsessive mind. Corbin and Rossi spent days sifting through Silas's belongings. The house was a monument to his intellect and his isolation. There were thousands of books, all meticulously catalogued. There were complex chemical equations scribbled on chalkboards in his study. There were detailed, hand-drawn maps of the vineyard's soil composition. But there were no personal effects, no letters from friends or family, no photographs of loved ones. It was a life devoid of human connection. The breakthrough came in a locked, steel footlocker hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Silas's study. Inside were not journals of his daily life, but a series of thick, leather-bound ledgers, filled with his elegant, spidery cursive. They were his preservation journals. Corbin sat in his office late into the night, the rest of the station quiet and still, and began to read. The early entries were purely scientific, detailing his experiments with preserving grapes, flowers, and insects in various chemical and wine-based solutions. He wrote with a chilling, detached, scientific prose, his obsession with arresting decay, with capturing and holding a fleeting moment of perfect beauty, evident on every page. He saw decomposition as an imperfection, a flaw in nature's design that he, through his genius, could correct. But as the journals progressed, the subject of his experiments became more ambitious. He wrote of preserving small animals, birds, rabbits, a fox with a disturbing lack of emotion, his only focus on the efficacy of his preserving agents. He was perfecting his formula, his elixir of permanence, as he called it. And then her name appeared, Alara. The detached, scientific prose of the earlier entries vanished, replaced by something else. Something lyrical, poetic, and terrifyingly obsessive. Alara, according to Silas's writings, was a traveling artist, a free spirit with eyes the color of a stormy sky, and a laugh that could make the vines themselves weep with joy. She had stumbled upon his secluded villa one summer afternoon, looking for a place to paint the valley's golden, rolling hills. Silas, the recluse who had not spoken to another human being in years, was utterly, completely, and irrevocably captivated. He wrote of her with the feverish, desperate intensity of a religious zealot who had just found his God. She was, to him, the epitome of perfect, fleeting beauty. And the thought of her aging, of her beauty fading, of her leaving him and his valley, became an unbearable torment to him. The journals became a chilling, day-by-day account of his growing obsession. He documented their conversations, her innocent kindness, her fascination with his work. He saw her interest not as friendship, but as a confirmation of their shared, superior souls. He began to see her not as a person, but as a perfect specimen, the ultimate subject for his life's work. The final entries were a detailed, horrifying blueprint for a murder. He wrote of drugging her wine during a late-night conversation in his study. He wrote of his profound, almost orgasmic sense of triumph as she fell into a deep, unending sleep. He wrote, with the meticulous, detached precision of a surgeon, of the process of preparing her body, of submerging her in the dolium, of filling it with his perfected, crimson-colored elixir of permanence. She will not fade. He wrote in the final, chilling entry, the ink slightly smeared as if his hand was trembling with excitement. She will not leave. I have captured her beauty, her perfection, for all eternity. She is mine, forever, perfect vintage, sleeping in the cool, dark earth. My masterpiece. Corbin had to put the journal down, a cold sweat beating on his forehead. In all his years, he had never encountered a killer who had so lovingly, so meticulously, documented his own atrocity. Silas Croft was not a monster in the traditional sense. He was not a creature of rage or impulse. He was a monster of intellect, of patience, of a twisted, obsessive, possessive love that saw preservation as the ultimate act of devotion. The identity of the victim was now almost certainly Alara. A search of national missing persons databases from the time period Silas was writing the early 1970s yielded a hit. Alara Vance, a 24-year-old artist from Oregon, reported missing by her family after she had set off on a cross-country trip to paint America's landscapes. Her last postcard had been sent from a small town just a few miles from the Serafina Valley. The case had gone cold decades ago, another forgotten file in a dusty cabinet. Until now, the police had their victim, they had their killer, and they had a full, detailed confession, written in the killer's own hand. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. But for Miles Corbin it felt anything but. The horror of Silas Croft's crime was not just in the act of murder itself. It was in the cold, calculated, artistic precision of it all. It was in the decades of silence that had followed, the knowledge that for 50 years, as the world turned and the seasons changed, Alara Vance had been sleeping in her terracotta tomb. A perfectly preserved secret, a shocking atrocity waiting in the dark to be discovered. The chills that had run down his spine in that cellar had not subsided. If anything, now that he knew the full, terrible story, they were colder and more permanent than ever. The official closure of the Alara Vance case was a quiet, administrative affair. A press conference was held, where the stoic, tight-lipped chief of police read a carefully worded statement. He spoke of a historical crime, a tragedy from a bygone era that had finally been brought to light. The names of Silas Croft and Alara Vance were released to the public, and for a brief, fleeting moment, their story became a macabre sensation, a lurid headline in the national news cycle, the wine jar horror, the vintner's ghastly secret, beauty preserved in death. The media, like a flock of hungry vultures, descended on the Serafina Valley, their cameras and microphones a jarring, intrusive presence in the quiet, sun-drenched landscape. But for the three people at the heart of the storm, Leo Croft, the unwitting inheritor of this house of horrors, Miles Corbin, the detective whose soul had been indelibly stained by the discovery, and Alara Vance, the silent, central figure in the tragedy. The closure of the case was merely the beginning of a long, unquiet aftermath. For Leo, the Villa Serafina was no longer a potential asset to be liquidated. It was a mausoleum, a crime scene. He couldn't set foot in the house without feeling the oppressive weight of his great-uncle's madness, without smelling the phantom, cloying scent of the elixir of permanence. The beautiful, rolling hills of the vineyard, which had at first seemed so peaceful, now felt menacing, their beauty a deceptive mask for the dark, terrible secret the earth had held for so long. He couldn't sell it. Who would buy a property with such a grotesque, well-publicized history? It had become his inheritance in the truest sense of the word, a burden he was now shackled to. He moved out of the villa and into a small, sterile motel in the nearby town of Oakhaven, the anonymity of the generic room a welcome, if temporary, respite. But he couldn't bring himself to leave the valley. He felt a strange, inexplicable sense of responsibility, a duty not to his monstrous relative, but to the woman whose final resting place he had so brutally disturbed. He met with Detective Corbin several times, the two of them forming an unlikely, unspoken bond, two men linked by a shared trauma. Leo provided what little family history he knew, and in return, Corbin allowed him to read excerpts from Silas's journals. He needed to understand. He needed to know the story of the woman his great-uncle had so cruelly, so obsessively stolen from the world. Reading Silas's words was a nauseating, profoundly unsettling experience. He saw the genesis of a monster, the twisted, intellectual justification for an unforgivable act. But he also saw Alara, brought to life through the words of her killer. He saw her vibrancy, her kindness, her free spirit. She became a real person to him, not just a preserved specimen in a jar. She was an artist, a dreamer, a young woman full of life and promise, and the injustice of her fate became a personal, aching wound in Leo's soul. The local authorities, with no living relatives to claim her, had planned to bury Alara in an unmarked potter's field, a final, anonymous end to her tragic story. Leo couldn't allow it. Using a portion of the small inheritance he had received from Silas's bank account, he claimed her body. He had her cremated, an act of purification, of releasing her from the chemical prison that had been her body for 50 years. He found the highest point on the 20-acre property, a beautiful, wind-swept knoll that overlooked the entire valley. It was the kind of spot an artist, a painter of landscapes, would have loved. And there, beneath a gnarled, ancient oak tree, he buried her ashes. He commissioned a simple, elegant headstone, a block of unpolished granite. It read, Alara Vance, 1949 to 1973. Artist. Free spirit. Finally at peace. The act was a turning point for Leo. In giving Alara a final, dignified resting place, he had found a purpose. He would not run from his inheritance. He would reclaim it. He would transform it. He would not allow Silas Croft's darkness to have the final word. He began the slow, arduous process of bringing the vineyard back to life. He hired a local crew to help him clear the overgrown jungle, to prune the neglected, gnarled vines. He enrolled in viticulture classes at the local community college, immersing himself in the language of the land, of the soil, of the grapes. He learned that the vines his great-uncle had cultivated were a rare, almost forgotten varietal, known for producing a wine of incredible complexity and depth. Silas, for all his madness, had been a genius of the earth. He decided he would never live in the Villa Serafina. The house itself remained locked and silent, a monument to the past. He had the entrance to the wine cellar sealed, not with new mortar, but with a solid wall of concrete. The hidden chamber, the terracotta tomb, was to be buried and forgotten forever. He built a small, simple cottage for himself on the other side of the property, a place of light and air, as far from the villa's shadows as possible. His goal was not to make a fortune. It was to create a tribute. He would name his first vintage Lalera, and a portion of all proceeds would go to a foundation he established in her name, a grant for young, traveling female artists. He would turn the symbol of her death into a celebration of her life. He was transforming a place of horror into a place of healing. For Miles Corbin, the case was a ghost that walked beside him every day. The images from the cellar were seared into his memory, a permanent, unwelcome gallery in the museum of his mind. He had seen death in all its brutal, senseless forms, but this was different. This was a crime that had transcended simple violence. It was a crime of philosophy, of a twisted, perverted intellect. It had shaken his belief in the simple dichotomies of good and evil, sane and insane. Silas Croft was not a madman in the conventional sense. He was a man of profound and meticulous reason. His reason was just built on a monstrous, horrifying foundation. The case had changed him. The cynical, detached shell he had worn for so many years had been cracked, and he found himself more empathetic, more vulnerable, more affected by the tragedies he witnessed on a daily basis. He became quieter, more contemplative. He started visiting his estranged daughter, trying to mend the bridges his long, obsessive career had burned. The ghost of Alara Vance, a woman he had never known, had, in a strange way, given him back a piece of his own humanity. A year after the discovery, on a crisp, golden autumn afternoon, Corbin drove out to the vineyard. The transformation was remarkable. The vines were healthy and vibrant, heavy with ripe, purple grapes. The wild, chaotic jungle had been tamed into a place of serene, cultivated beauty. He found Leo on the knoll, sitting by Alara's headstone, looking out over the valley. They didn't say much for a while, the two of them just sharing the comfortable silence of men who had been through a fire together. "The first harvest is next week," Leo said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The wine won't be ready for a few years, but it's a start." "It's more than a start," Corbin replied, his eyes drifting to the simple stone marker. "It's a goddamn miracle." Leo finally looked at him, a faint, sad smile on his face. "I had to do something. Couldn't let him win. I couldn't let the story end in that cellar." They both looked towards the Villa Serafina, a silent, brooding shadow in the afternoon sun. It was still there, a reminder of the darkness that had once resided in this beautiful, sun-drenched place. The ghosts of the Villa Serafina would likely never be fully exorcised. But here, on this windswept knoll, under the shade of an ancient oak tree, a new story was being written. A story of remembrance. A story of reclamation. A story of a life so brutally and senselessly cut short that was now, in some small, beautiful way, being given back to the world. The atrocity in the wine jar had sent a chill through the very soul of the valley. But now, finally, after 50 long years, a fragile, tentative warmth was beginning to return.